Lake Jackson in Tallahassee. We're actually inside Porter Sink.
This is Lake Jackson. Just dried up.
You wake up one morning, looking out your back window, and realizing the massive lake behind your house is just gone. No massive flood, no slow evaporation, just 4,000 acres of water swallowed whole by the earth itself. That is exactly what happened to Lake Jackson. 12 billion gallons of water vanished right down a massive hole in the lakebed, leaving behind nothing but stranded boats, flopping fish, and a cracked, muddy wasteland. It sounds like a sci-fi movie, but the reality is way crazier. The day the water vanished. The transition from a pristine, shimmering expanse of water to a desolate wasteland of dried mud doesn't happen with the slow, predictable rhythm of the changing seasons. It happens with a sudden, violent urgency that catches the world completely off guard. On a normal Tuesday morning in Tallahassee, Florida, Lake Jackson looked exactly as it had for decades. It was a crown jewel of the local landscape, a massive 4,000-acre aquatic sanctuary teeming with life. Bass fishermen cruised across its glassy surface in the early morning mist, their lines cutting clean entries into the water. Great blue herons waded through the thick green fields of lily pads that ringed the shoreline, hunting for minnows in the shallows. To anyone standing on the wooden observation decks or sitting on the docks of the lakefront homes, the water looked permanent, solid, and eternal. But beneath that calm, deceptive surface, an invisible clock was ticking down to zero. By the afternoon, the local rangers and property owners noticed something deeply unsettling. The waterline wasn't just dropping. It was retreating at a visible, terrifying pace. Docks that had been submerged in 6 feet of water just hours prior were suddenly baking in the harsh Florida sun, their wooden pilings exposed like rotting teeth. The gentle lapping of waves against the shore was replaced by a strange, sucking sound that echoed across the basin, a wet, guttural gurgle that signaled a massive structural failure at the bottom of the world. Within a matter of hours, the lake had transformed from a vibrant ecosystem into a giant, churning whirlpool. The scale of the disaster was almost impossible for the human mind to process. 12 billion gallons of water do not simply disappear without a trace. Yet, that is exactly what the residents of Leon County watched happen. To put 12 billion gallons into perspective, imagine more than 18,000 Olympic-sized swimming pools being drained simultaneously. Picture a wall of water a mile wide and dozens of feet high, suddenly vanishing into thin air. But it wasn't vanishing into the air. It was being forced downward by the immense weight of its own mass, funneling toward a single catastrophic point of failure in the lakebed. As the hours ticked by, the water levels flattened out completely, revealing the raw, naked anatomy of the lake floor. The sight was deeply apocalyptic. A vast, flat plain of dark, organic muck stretched out for miles where a thriving lake had stood just the day before. The transition was so rapid that nature itself could not keep up. Millions of fish were left stranded in the baking heat, flapping helplessly in shallow puddles that evaporated in minutes. Massive, largemouth bass, some weighing over 10 pounds, lay trapped in the heavy mud. A bounty for the hundreds of vultures and crows that descended upon the basin in a feeding frenzy. Alligators, stripped of their watery camouflage, blinked in confusion as they crawled across the open mudflats, desperately searching for any remaining pockets of moisture. For the locals who had spent their entire lives on the shores of Lake Jackson, the psychological shock was profound. Boaters who had parked their vessels at their private docks the evening before woke up to find their crafts dangling precariously from their lifts, suspended over empty air, and a drop of 20 feet to a floor of cracked earth. Pontoon boats lay tilted on their sides, half buried in the silt like shipwrecks from a long-forgotten war. The water had simply been deleted from the landscape, leaving behind an eerie, smoking moonscape that smelled heavily of decaying vegetation and exposed lake bottom. Word of the event spread like wildfire through Tallahassee, drawing crowds of onlookers to the edge of the newly formed desert. People stood along the highway overpasses and the banks of the state park, staring out in absolute disbelief. It looked as though someone had pulled a giant drain plug at the bottom of a massive bathtub. The water hadn't spilled over the banks, it hadn't flooded the surrounding neighborhoods, and it hadn't dried up over months of hot weather. It had been sucked violently into the dark belly of the earth, leaving a community to look out over a view that felt completely alien and terrifyingly unstable. The question on everyone's mind was no longer just about the water that was gone, but about the terrifying physical reality of what lay directly beneath their feet. The mystery only deepens when you realize the water didn't leak out slowly. It was violently pulled straight down by a monster hiding right beneath the mud. Inside the throat of Porter's Sink. How did a massive 4,000-acre body of water can completely drain away like a clogged bathtub? We have to stop looking at the surface waves and start examining the stone beneath the mud. The northern region of Florida does not sit on a foundation of solid, immutable bedrock. Instead, it rests precariously on top of a colossal, porous limestone shelf known as karst topography. This geological formation behaves less like solid rock and more like a massive piece of Swiss cheese, thoroughly honeycombed with vast underground caverns, flooded tunnels, and hidden subterranean rivers. Over millions of years, slightly acidic rainwater has slowly eaten away at the soft limestone, dissolving the mineral bonds and carving out an invisible world directly beneath the surface. It is within this fragile underground landscape that the mechanism responsible for Lake Jackson's disappearance sleeps. That mechanism has a name: Porter's Sink. Located in the southern basin of Lake Jackson, Porter's Sink is a massive structural opening that measures roughly 28 feet across at its throat. Under ordinary circumstances, a boater cruising across the lake would never even know it was there. When the lake is full, Porter's Sink is buried under yards of dark water, hidden from view by dense beds of native flora and a heavy, thick layer of organic muck. This accumulation of rotting leaves, thick sediment, and heavy clay acts exactly like a giant natural cork jammed tightly into the drain of a sink. For years at a time, this sediment plug holds firm, resisting the immense downward pressure of the billions of gallons of water resting directly on top of it. As long as the cork stays intact, Lake Jackson remains a beautiful, functional body of water, where people boat, swim, and fish. The stability of this natural plug depends entirely on a delicate game of hydraulic balance, and that balance requires crucial support from below. Deep underneath the limestone shelf sits the Floridan Aquifer, a massive subterranean freshwater reservoir that supplies millions of people with drinking water. When the aquifer is completely full, the water pressure inside these underground caves pushes upward against the ceiling of the caverns. This upward force acts as a structural pillar, counteracting the heavy downward weight of the lake water above. The sediment plug is essentially squeezed between two opposing forces, the weight of the lake pushing down and the pressure of the aquifer pushing up. As long as these two forces remain equal, the cork stays safely in place and the lake floor remains stable. However, when a severe drought hits the region, this entire equilibrium collapses. As months pass without any significant rainfall, the water levels within the underground aquifer begin to recede rapidly. The subterranean water table drops, and as the water drains out of the limestone caves, it leaves behind giant empty voids filled with nothing but low-pressure air. With the aquifer drained, the critical upward pressure supporting the ceiling of the caves vanishes completely. The structural pillars are gone, leaving the limestone ceiling and the sediment plug at the bottom of Lake Jackson to bear the full, crushing weight of 12 billion gallons of water entirely on their own. As the downward pressure grows increasingly lopsided, the stress on the sediment plug reaches a critical breaking point. Deep within the muck of Porter's Sink, tiny fissures begin to splinter through the compacted clay. Small streams of water begin to trickle through these microscopic cracks, carrying away bits of sediment and widening the gaps. This process is known as piping, and once it starts, it behaves like a runaway train. The moving water rapidly erodes the walls of the fissure, transforming small cracks into wide channels within hours. Suddenly, the structural integrity of the plug fails entirely. The remaining mass of clay and organic muck is violently blown out, collapsing downward into the empty, high-pressure voids of the dry aquifer caves below. With the cork officially pulled, the full force of Lake Jackson rushes toward the 28-foot-wide opening. The water creates a towering hydraulic funnel that twists and roars as it swallows everything in its path. Massive patches of lily pads are ripped up by their roots. Whirlpools drag floating logs deep into the throat of the sink, and billions of gallons of water tear through the opening, plunging down into the absolute darkness of the earth. With 12 billion gallons of water violently sucked into the dark, jagged throat of the earth, a haunting question echoed across the empty basin. Where does a vanished lake actually go? The 19-mile Ghost River. When a massive body of water drops straight down into the pitch-black underworld of a karst landscape, it doesn't just pool in a static cavern. It enters a hyper-pressurized, fast-moving labyrinth of subterranean highways that scientists are only just beginning to truly map. For decades, the ultimate fate of Lake Jackson's water was the subject of intense local myth, rumor, and speculation. Some believed it fed directly into nearby smaller lakes, while others suspected it traveled straight out to the Gulf of Mexico through deep marine vents. Unraveling this geological whodunit required a unique breed of scientific detective work, blending advanced chemistry with the daring exploits of hydrogeologists. The breakthrough came through the collaborative efforts of McGlynn Laboratories, the Wakulla Springs Alliance, and state environmental scientists who launched a series of groundbreaking tracer dye expeditions. The premise of a tracer dye study is deceptively simple, but executing it inside an unpredictable, newly opened sinkhole is incredibly complex. Scientists had to wait for the exact moment when the lake was in the final roaring stages of its dry-down event. Standing at the slippery, unstable rim of Porter Sink, researchers carefully injected massive quantities of highly concentrated, non-toxic, fluorescent dyes, such as rhodamine WT and fluorescin. Once the vibrant green and red dyes vanished into the dark maw of the sinkhole, the real waiting game began. These specialized dyes are chosen because they do not easily bind to soil particles, do not harm aquatic life, and do not degrade in total darkness, allowing them to travel vast distances completely unchanged. To catch the dye when it inevitably resurfaced, scientists deployed an extensive array of automated sampling devices and activated charcoal packets at dozens of springs, domestic wells, and rivers across North Florida. These monitoring stations checked the water continuously, searching for even microscopic parts per billion traces of the chemical markers. The results of the study completely shattered previous assumptions about the region's hidden hydrology. The dye didn't just seep slowly through the earth like water through a sponge. It traveled through the aquifer at a shocking speed. The automated sensors detected the first unmistakable spikes of fluorescent dye exactly 19 miles away, emerging from the deep, gaping volcanic-like cavern of Wakulla Spring. To map an unhindered connection across 19 miles of solid ground is remarkable, but the timeline was even more astonishing to researchers. The dye took roughly 35 days to complete its journey through the dark. By analyzing the speed, arrival times, and concentration curves of the returning dye, hydrologists calculated that the water wasn't trickling through tight pores in the limestone. Instead, it was barreling through a colossal, interconnected network of submerged conduits.
Lake Jackson is dry again for the second time this year.
It's hard to believe, but digging into why this natural phenomenon looks different than the first time around.
A literal ghost river flowing completely unseen beneath the pine forests, state highways, and suburban strip malls of Leon and Wakulla counties. This underground highway system is a place of absolute darkness, freezing temperatures, and immense hydraulic pressure. As the massive volume of water from Lake Jackson tears through these limestone tunnels, it acts as a physical chisel, carving the soft stone further, causing localized cave-ins, and creating vast rooms and deep vertical shafts that rival any dry cavern system discovered on dry land. The tracer study proved definitively that North Florida's surface water and groundwater are not two separate entities. They are deeply intertwined components of a single fluid loop that reacts instantly to changes at the surface. The dramatic climax of this subterranean journey occurs at Wakulla Spring, internationally recognized as one of the largest, deepest, and most prolific freshwater springs on the planet. Under normal conditions, Wakulla Spring discharges hundreds of millions of gallons of crystal-clear water every single day, creating a thriving river ecosystem home to manatees, alligators, and rare water birds. But in the weeks following a Lake Jackson collapse, the entire personality of the spring changes dramatically. As the billions of gallons of drained lake water finally reach the end of their 19-mile journey, they surge upward from the deep basin of the spring. Because Lake Jackson's water carries heavy loads of organic debris, tannic acids from decaying shoreline leaves, and loose surface sediments, it turns the normally crystalline, turquoise waters of Wakala Spring into a dark, murky brown, resembling sweet tea. This dramatic shift provides a vivid visual confirmation of the tracer dye data to anyone standing on the spring's edge. The water that local residents watched vanish down a muddy hole in Tallahassee is reborn over a month later, bubbling back into the sunlight to feed the coastal rivers that ultimately flow toward the sea. As the last of the brown, tannic water gurgles down into the underground dark, the surface of Lake Jackson transforms into a biological battlefield and a historical time capsule. Stranded worlds. When a 4,000-acre lake evaporates overnight into a sinkhole, it leaves behind a scene of immediate, staggering ecological devastation.
The lake dries out, as you can see behind me. That's because of two sinkholes under it. And when that happens, it uncovers the secrets beyond the water.
For the millions of creatures that call Lake Jackson home, the opening of Porter Sink is nothing short of an environmental apocalypse. The water that once protected, cooled, and sustained them is violently stripped away, forcing a brutal and immediate struggle for survival out in the open. The immediate aftermath presents a stark, almost haunting landscape where life must instantly adapt or perish in the baking Florida sun. The hardest hit are the lake's fish populations. Massive largemouth bass, bluegill, and black crappie find themselves trapped in rapidly shrinking pools of muddy water that heat up to lethal temperatures within hours. As the remaining puddles evaporate under the intense heat, millions of fish are left flopping helplessly on the hot, exposed mud. This sudden, massive bounty triggers an immediate response from the region's apex predators and scavengers. Within hours of the drain, the sky above Lake Jackson fills with thousands of birds. Vultures, crows, and bald eagles descend upon the exposed lakebed in a deafening, chaotic feeding frenzy. Standing alongside them are hundreds of great blue herons and white ibises, gorging themselves on the stranded aquatic life until they can barely fly. For the lake's apex reptiles, the transformation is equally disorienting. Alligators, stripped of the deep water that allowed them to hunt and remain camouflaged, are suddenly exposed to the open air. Local residents often witness the surreal sight of dozens of large alligators trekking across the vast, sun-baked mud flats, searching desperately for any remaining sloughs or deep puddles that haven't yet vanished down the drain. Many turtles, including soft shells and sliders, choose to burrow deep into the thick, wet organic muck, entering a state of semi-dormancy in a desperate bid to survive until the rains return. Those that stay on the surface face a grueling march toward the shorelines, completely vulnerable to predators. Yet, amid the grim reality of this ecological reset, the empty basin of Lake Jackson reveals a completely different side. It becomes a pristine, historically rich time capsule. For centuries, the thick, oxygen-poor mud at the bottom of the lake has acted as a perfect preservative, shielding artifacts from decay and human interference. The moment the water vanishes, the lakebed is transformed into an open-air museum, drawing a massive influx of geologists, state archaeologists, and enthusiastic local fossil hunters. Walking out onto the dried, cracked earth is like stepping backward through thousands of years of human and natural history. Among the most significant discoveries made during these dry-down events are ancient Native American dugout canoes. Carved from solid cypress logs by the region's earliest inhabitants thousands of years ago, these canoes were lost or intentionally submerged in the lake's shallow waters. The heavy mud of the lakebed kept them perfectly preserved, preventing the wood from rotting away. When the water drains, these prehistoric vessels are left sitting high and dry on the mudflats. State archaeologists must race against the clock to document, stabilize, and excavate these fragile pieces of history before exposure to the air and sun causes the ancient, waterlogged wood to splinter and disintegrate. Alongside the cultural artifacts, The exposed limestone formations around Porter Sink offer scientists a rare front-row seat to the region's deep geological past. Layers of stone that haven't seen daylight for millennia are suddenly fully accessible. Paleontologists walking the basin regularly uncover the fossilized teeth of prehistoric sharks, ancient whale bones, and the remains of Ice Age megafauna like mastodons and giant ground sloths that once gathered around the ancient watering hole. Every foot of exposed mud tells a story of an ever-changing climate and a landscape that has shifted dramatically over millions of years. For local residents, walking out into the empty basin is a surreal, sobering experience. People can stand on the very spots where they once drove motorboats, looking up at the high water marks stained on distant dock pilings 20 feet above their heads. They find lost anchor chains, dropped fishing lures, and old boat propellers half buried in the silt alongside fossilized shells from a time when Florida was entirely underwater. This temporary wasteland becomes a place of profound discovery, showing that while the surface world can be deleted in a matter of hours, the history buried beneath it remains completely intact, waiting for the drain plug to pull back the curtain. While the exposed mudflats offer a playground for historians and scientists, they also expose a terrifying truth. The ancient rhythm that once governed this vanishing lake is permanently broken. The broken clock. To truly comprehend the gravity of what is happening at Lake Jackson, one must look past the immediate shock of the empty basin and look into the historical record. This lake is not merely undergoing a random freak geological disaster. It is a system governed by a clock that has kept time across centuries of human and natural history. But in recent decades, the gears of that clock have begun to grind, skip, and accelerate at an alarming rate. What was once a predictable, healthy ecological cycle has transformed into a chaotic and volatile symptom of a much larger systemic planetary crisis. For over 200 years, the draining of Lake Jackson was documented by early naturalists, Native American tribes, and Spanish explorers as a rare, awe-inspiring spectacle. The historical baseline was clear and remarkably consistent. Porter Sink would breach its sediment plug and drain the lake roughly once every 25 years. This extended timeline was critical to the health of the entire ecosystem. In the natural order of things, a 25-year interval allowed the lake to function as a stable, long-term aquatic habitat. Generations of fish, plants, and reptiles could thrive, balance out their populations, and establish a deeply rooted ecological community.
There are 2 sinkholes under the lake, slowly draining. Over time, especially with low rainfall, the hole opens up even more. There is some good that comes with the draining. It removes that muck and sediment, creating a better environment for the fish to return.
When the lake did occasionally drain on this 25-year schedule, it was not viewed as a tragedy, but rather as a profound ecological reset button. The dry-down phase served an essential housekeeping purpose for nature. Over decades of life, a thick, suffocating layer of organic muck, rotting weeds, and decaying fish accumulates on the lakebed. If left unchecked, this muck chokes out native vegetation, deprives the lower water columns of vital oxygen, and turns a healthy lake into a stagnant swamp. By exposing the lake floor to the sun and air every quarter century, the muck would completely dry out, crack, and consolidate. Frequent lightning strikes during Florida summer storms would ignite natural wildfires across the dry basin, safely burning away the dead vegetation without harming the surrounding forests. When the rains eventually returned, they refilled a freshly scrubbed, nutrient-rich basin where new life could flourish. It was a perfect, self-cleaning system. However, if you map the timeline of Lake Jackson's recent drains, you quickly realize that the natural clock has been completely shattered. Since the late 90s, the lake has not waited 25 years to drain. It has emptied out 6 times. Instead of decades between dry downs, the intervals have compressed into mere years, and sometimes a few short months. Porter Sink is no longer acting like an occasional pressure valve release. It is acting like a permanently leaky valve that cannot hold a seal. This terrifying acceleration cannot be blamed on local geology alone. Limestone doesn't change its physical properties over 30 years, and Porter Sink hasn't magically grown wider. The true culprit behind the collapsing cycle is a direct, undeniable human fingerprint: the heavy overpumping of the Floridan aquifer combined with the rising threat of climate-driven flash droughts. One must look at the explosive population growth and agricultural expansion of the southeastern United States over the last half-century to understand human connection. The Floridan aquifer is one of the most productive groundwater systems in the world, stretching across multiple states and serving as the primary source of drinking water for millions of people. Every single day, municipal water systems pump hundreds of millions of gallons of water out of the ground to supply the booming suburbs of Tallahassee and beyond. Simultaneously, massive agricultural operations drill deep wells into the limestone to irrigate thousands of acres of crops, drawing down incomprehensible volumes of water. This relentless extraction has had a catastrophic impact on the aquifer's subterranean water pressure. As the water table inside the underground caves is drawn down deeper and deeper by human consumption, the crucial upward hydraulic pressure that supports the ceiling of the caverns drops permanently. Remember, the sediment plug inside Porter Sink relies entirely on this upward pressure to stay wedged into the drain. Without it, the plug is left dangling over a low-pressure void, entirely unsupported from below. The structural balance of the lakebed is permanently skewed toward collapse. Making matters worse is the emergence of a new meteorological phenomenon fueled by a warming atmosphere, the flash drought. Unlike traditional droughts, which develop slowly over several seasons, a flash drought strikes with terrifying speed. Higher atmospheric temperatures increase evaporation rates exponentially, stripping the soil and surface water of moisture in a matter of weeks rather than months. When a flash drought hits North Florida, surface water levels drop rapidly, while public and agricultural water demands spike to record highs as people try to keep lawns and crops alive. This creates the ultimate hydrogeological storm. The aquifer is pumped down faster than ever before to meet human needs, while the lake level drops from above, destabilizing the sediment plug. Under this intense, multi-directional stress, the fragile plug inside Porter Sink simply cannot hold. It cracks, erodes, and blows out under pressures that it was never geologically designed to handle on such a frequent loop. The consequences of this broken clock are devastating for the long-term survival of the lake. Because the dry downs are happening every few years instead of every few decades, the ecosystem has zero time to recover. Fish populations are wiped out before they can reach maturity. Native plants don't have time to re-establish their root systems before the next drain kills them off or the next sudden flood drowns them. Lake Jackson is trapped in an exhausting, permanent cycle of trauma and reset, never allowed to heal. It stands as a vivid, unmistakable warning sign carved into the Florida landscape, a clear message that the invisible groundwater systems we rely on for our survival are being pushed far past their breaking points, and the ground beneath us is running out of time, waiting for the sky to open. The future of Lake Jackson now hinges on an agonizing waiting game, one that plays out on a stage dictated entirely by the atmosphere. To bring a vanished lake back from the dead requires much more than a routine afternoon thunderstorm. It demands an absolute, colossal atmospheric event, the kind of sustained, multi-day deluge delivered only by tropical storms or stalled weather fronts. Millions of gallons of water must fall continuously across the entire regional watershed, working down through the soil to meticulously refill the vast, depleted chambers of the Floridan aquifer. Only when those subterranean limestone caverns are completely gorged with water will the crucial upward hydraulic pressure return, forcing the subterranean water table back up to the surface and effectively restabilizing the delicate sediment plug inside Porter Sink. Until that structural balance is restored, any normal rainfall that gathers in the basin will simply swirl down the 28-foot-wide throat, vanishing instantly into the dark underworld. But the story of Lake Jackson is far bigger than a single volatile body of water in North Florida. It serves as an undeniable, highly visual canary in the coal mine for global groundwater depletion. All across the planet, invisible underground aquifers are being aggressively pumped dry to sustain expanding cities and industrial agriculture, operating entirely out of sight and out of mind for the average consumer. Because these water systems are buried deep beneath layers of soil and stone, their slow, systematic destruction remains completely imperceptible to the public until a catastrophic tipping point is reached. Lake Jackson strips away that invisibility. It forces us to look directly into the open throat of a collapsing water table, turning abstract environmental data into a jarring physical reality. The empty, smoking basin stands as a stark visual reminder that our surface worlds are intimately, inextricably bound to the hidden plumbing beneath our feet. As we continue to overdraw our planetary accounts, the ground beneath us will continue to give way, serving notice that the resources we assume are eternal are far more fragile than we ever dared to imagine. What do you think of the drain? Leave your comments below and subscribe to the channel for our future uploads.